In the quiet town of Hickory Falls, retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Maggie Sloan, who lost a leg in Iraq, frequents a local diner. One morning, three menacing bikers, Red, Bones, and Slug, swagger in and begin to harass Maggie in her wheelchair. Their cruel taunts escalate when Slug deliberately tips her chair, sending her sprawling on the floor, unnoticed by anyone but a young boy, Eli, and his father, Tom. The diner falls into a stunned silence, its patrons and staff offering no aid. Tom, a quiet veteran, steps outside and makes a purposeful, cryptic phone call to a Sergeant Daniels, hinting at an imminent and powerful intervention. The question hangs in the air. What will happen next, and what kind of intervention has Tom set in motion? If Maggie's story of silent strength and a community's rediscovery of its spine resonated with you, imagine the powerful narratives we can share next. Hit that subscribe button and join our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to light. Let's continue to honor the quiet heroes among us. Don't miss out. She really should have picked a different place to eat. These kinds of diners weren't made for people on wheels. At least, not people like her. A sharp, mocking laugh sliced through the hum of clinking plates and low conversation. Words followed, cutting, deliberate. Three men in worn leather vests loitered near the entrance like they owned the place, smugness etched into every inch of their posture. One of them broke away from the group and stepped forward. With a cruel little smirk, he leaned in and tipped her wheelchair just enough to send her rolling, uncontrolled, into the edge of a booth. The impact rattled the table. Silverware crashed to the floor in a metallic clatter. A splash of scalding coffee leapt from a mug and dripped onto the linoleum. But she didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she braced her palm against the floor and steadied herself in silence. Her jaw tightened, but her dignity held firm. Nobody moved, not the waitress, who froze behind the counter with a coffee pot mid-pour, not the manager, who disappeared into the back room, not the other customers, who suddenly found their pancakes or menus intensely fascinating. Everyone pretended not to see, except for a boy, maybe 8 or 9, sitting with his father 2 booths over. The boy's eyes were wide. His father, a quiet man in a faded camouflage cap, met Maggie's gaze for just a moment. Then he looked away, but not before something changed in his expression, something resolute. 30 minutes later, the low growl of an engine rolled down Main Street. A military green SUV pulled up outside the diner, parking with unmistakable precision. 3 Marines stepped out, and just like that, the diner went still. Hickory Falls wasn't the kind of town that made the news. It was quiet, tucked away, with a single traffic light that blinked more than it functioned, a handful of aging churches, and one diner that hadn't seen a renovation or a fresh coat of paint in over 4 decades. Locals called it Grers, though everyone knew the sign above the door used to read Grers. The G and R had long since peeled off, and no one had bothered to replace them. The coffee was bitter enough to burn through your tongue, but it was familiar. The eggs were always 5 minutes late, but miraculously always hot. That place, with its cracked red booths and fly-speck clock that ran 8 minutes slow, was as much a fixture of the town as the old grain silo or the retired fire engine they used in parades. And in the far left corner, beneath that crooked clock, sat Margaret Maggie Sloan, as she had nearly every weekday for the last 3 years. Maggie was 52 years old, a retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant who'd served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. She left the Corps decorated with medals and, missing her left leg, lost to a roadside bomb outside of Fallujah. She didn't talk about it much. Didn't need to. The quiet way she moved through the world told the story just fine. Each morning, like clockwork, she rolled into the diner at 10:45 a.m. in her black manual wheelchair. The right wheel let out a soft, high-pitched squeal when she leaned into it too hard, and the left brake needed a sharp tug before it locked properly. Her prosthetic leg, government-issued and cold to the touch, sat mostly unused in the corner of her 1-bedroom apartment, 2 floors above Miller's Hardware. These days, the chair was easier, more honest. She never asked for anything special, never made a scene when people stared, never complained when the fryer snapped oil too close to her hands. She just worked, rolled silverware into paper napkins with a focus that most people mistook for coldness. But anyone who really looked saw something else, a sharp, precise rhythm, the kind of control you don't forget after years of loading weapons under fire. The people of Hickory Falls knew who she was. They nodded politely when she passed, occasionally offered a quiet, "Thank you for your service," before hurrying on their way. That was the extent of it. She was recognized but not really seen, part of the backdrop, as ordinary and ignored as the old jukebox that hadn't played a tune in decades, or the ceiling fan that clicked annoyingly with each slow turn. That morning had begun like any other. She was finishing her second coffee, rolling napkins for the lunch rush, when the peace shattered. The front door slammed open, not just loud, but aggressively loud. The kind of slam that was meant to provoke. The kind that said, "Look at me." Three men strolled in like they owned the building. All wore black leather vests patched with emblems and crude words that didn't belong in polite company. Red, Bones, Slug. Nobody in town knew their real names and no one really cared to. They weren't part of any formal gang, just middle-aged men from two towns over who'd bought themselves tough guy costumes and spent their weekends looking for places to make noise. Red was the biggest, broad chest, shaved head, and a jagged scar that carved its way down one side of his jaw. Bones was wiry and twitchy, constantly gnawing on toothpicks as if his jaw was looking for a fight. Slug, trailing behind, had the sticky sheen of someone who hadn't showered in days, maybe weeks. Even his shadow seemed reluctant to follow him. They claimed a booth near the front and immediately made their presence felt, slapping the table, barking with laughter, making lewd jokes, and staring at the waitress like she was part of the decor. The mood inside the diner shifted. Voices dropped. Conversations died mid-sentence. A thick discomfort filled the air like smoke. Maggie didn't lift her eyes. She just kept folding napkins. But Red saw her. "Well, damn," he muttered with a grin, elbowing Bones hard enough to make him choke on his toothpick. He had seen her, and he had plans. The diner had gone quiet the moment she rolled in. "Looks like we've got ourselves a visitor from the V," someone muttered. Bones let out a snort, low and mean. "Put the scrap metal in." Maggie said nothing. Slug leaned in with a smirk. "Maybe she's part of the floor show. I bet she folds napkins better than she ever marched." The waitress froze halfway through pouring a cup of coffee. Conversations died out. Forks paused midair, every head bowed toward plates, as if silence could undo the words already spoken. In a booth tucked into the far corner, a boy named Eli stared with wide eyes, a crayon clutched tightly in one hand, his other gripping a paper placemat covered in half-finished doodles. Across from him sat his father, Tom, tall, wiry, and quiet in a sun-bleached camouflage jacket. Years of war had taught him the value of silence, and he watched now with the sharp stillness of someone who knew exactly when to act and when to wait. Red rose from his seat. He walked slowly, boots striking the tile with exaggerated weight, each step a performance. He came to a halt just behind Maggie's chair. "Hey, soldier girl," he called out, loud enough for every last person in the room to hear. "Think you can roll us some coffee? Or do you need permission from your commanding officer first?" Maggie turned her head just enough to look at him, her expression cool, unreadable. "Cream or black?" Bones howled with laughter. Red didn't. His lips curled in disgust. "You got some nerves," he muttered. "People like you are the reason this country's gone soft." Still, Maggie didn't react. No twitch, no flinch. She turned toward the coffee station, poured 3 mugs in practiced silence, set them carefully on a tray, and wheeled them to the table. Without so much as a glance, she placed the mugs down one by one. Then she turned to go. Slug struck fast. It happened so suddenly that no one understood what they were seeing until it had already happened. He stepped behind her, grabbed the handles of her wheelchair, and shoved. "Avert, hero," he sneered. He didn't push hard, just enough to send a message. To humiliate. The chair jerked forward, clipped the corner of a booth. Maggie lost control. The tray slipped from her lap. One cup shattered on the floor, shards skipping across the tile. Hot coffee splashed across her forearm, and then she was down, face first against the cold, unforgiving floor. The entire diner froze. The waitress stood stiff. The manager didn't move. Not a soul dared breathe. Except Eli. He dropped his crayon. "Dad," he whispered, "is that lady a soldier?" Tom rose, slowly, his gaze fixed on Maggie, not on the spilled coffee, not on the man who'd pushed her, but on the woman herself. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She braced her hands on the ground and pushed herself up with the determination of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Her breathing was calm, her jaw locked tight. Her coat had come undone in the fall, and as she straightened, a battered leather wallet slid from the inside pocket. A photograph fell out. It landed face up right in the open. 7 Marines in dusty desert gear, arms slung over each other's shoulders, standing tall beneath a blinding sun. Every face was smiling, every one of them impossibly young. Maggie stood dead center. Across the back, barely legible in faded marker, were the words, "She carried us all." Tom's face didn't change. He turned, walked out the diner, and pulled out his phone. Inside, Maggie bent down slowly. She picked up the photograph, dabbed away the streaks of coffee, slid it back into her wallet. Then she turned without expression and returned to her booth in the corner. She resumed folding napkins, hands moving in stiff, mechanical precision, because that's what Marines do. Even when no one salutes, even when no one sees, they remain standing, if only on the inside. Outside, the Idaho sun had begun to dip behind the ridge. The sky turned amber and gold, streaked with quiet fire. Gravel cracked under Tom's boots as he approached his old Chevy. He didn't slam the door, didn't even glance back. He leaned against the hood, unlocked his phone, and scrolled through numbers he hadn't touched in years. Tom Parker wasn't a man of loud words. He believed in action. Quiet, deliberate, unannounced. The kind you learned in sand and heat, far from home, in places where speeches didn't matter and resolve was everything. From the parking lot, he looked back through the diner window. Maggie sat alone, her head slightly bowed, folding a napkin around a knife and fork like it was the most important thing in the world. Her face gave nothing away, but her shoulders, there was something heavy in the slope of them, a burden that went deeper than bruises. Tom inhaled, slow and deep. Then he brought the phone to his ear. It rang once. A voice picked up. "Sergeant Daniels." Tom didn't waste time. "It's Parker," he said. "Hickory Falls. I'm calling about one of ours." A brief pause followed. "Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Sloan." The voice on the other end stilled, silent for a beat. Then, "I know her. What happened?" Tom's jaw tensed so tightly it looked like it might snap. Public assault, civilian side, a bunch of biker punks tipped her wheelchair. Thought it was funny, laughed like it was a joke, and no one, not a soul, stepped in. No one did a damn thing. Another pause, not from hesitation, calculation. "Is she okay?" She picked herself up, like she always does. "That's not the damn point, is it?" Silence. Tom's voice dropped an octave, rough now. "I brought my son. He saw it. He watched it. I'll be damned if the first memory he has of a Marine is that." A breath passed in silence before the voice returned. Calm, steady, steel beneath velvet. "You wanted this off the record. Civilian ground. But make it matter. Make it count. Understood?" Tom ended the call without another word. He slid the phone back into his coat pocket, then stared out at the mountains for a long moment, still as a statue. When he turned and walked back inside, it was as if nothing had happened. Inside, the diner hadn't changed. Red had his boots kicked up on the edge of the table, casually spinning a butter knife between his fingers like it was a toy. Bones let out a loud, crude laugh at something Slug had muttered low under his breath. Their drinks had been topped off. The waitress didn't make eye contact. The manager hadn't shown his face since. The regulars kept to themselves, all performing that unique brand of small-town discomfort, where everyone sees everything, but nobody ever says a word. Maggie just kept going, roll, fold, place. Her hands moved with a quiet rhythm, napkins and silverware passing through her fingers like she didn't have to think. Her sleeve was stained with cold coffee. A bruise was starting to bloom purple on her hip. She didn't say a word. Pain was something she knew. But what stung worse, what settled like a splinter under her ribs, was the silence. The room had watched and done nothing. She had survived war zones, mortars falling without warning, sand turning red before it cooled. But this, Being tipped like unwanted furniture in a greasy spoon diner, this felt colder than combat ever had. Because this was allowed to happen. Because no one had cared. Or at least that's how it seemed. In the corner booth, Eli sat utterly still, his small hands wrapped around a glass of lemonade he hadn't touched. His eyes stayed on Maggie, confused, a little guilty. He didn't fully understand what he'd seen, not exactly, but he felt it. He knew something wasn't right. He knew it in his chest. Across from him, Tom sat motionless, his eyes locked on the bikers. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a punch, but something in the air had shifted. Not a storm, not yet, but the pressure was building, like the faint vibration before thunder. Red barked out a laugh louder than it needed to be. "Place needs better help," he said, sneering, tossing a sugar packet down. Or maybe just a mop. Maggie didn't flinch, didn't look up. She added another bundle to the bin. A soft clink. That was all. The wall clock kept ticking. The low murmur of conversation had returned to Granger's diner, the familiar clink of glasses and the hush of silverware scraping plates. But it all felt thinner now, stretched, fragile, like fabric pulled tight over a cracked frame. The laughter from the bikers' booth grew louder, sharper, deliberate now, like they knew no one would stop them, and that gave them permission to perform. Red leaned back, one boot still arrogantly planted on the table. Slug kept flicking sugar packets at a ketchup bottle like it owed him something. Bones was in the middle of a story involving a bar fight, 3 cops, and a duct-taped raccoon. No one laughed with them, but no one told them to stop either. The waitress stayed far from their booth, clinging to the counter, pretending to clean a coffee pot she'd already scrubbed spotless 15 minutes ago. Dave, the manager, hadn't stepped out of the kitchen once since it happened. And Maggie hadn't said a single word. She remained in her usual corner, sleeves damp from the spill, the left side of her shirt darkening where the stain spread. Her back stayed straight, her hands steady. She folded napkins with mechanical precision, movements smooth with repetition. But she wasn't folding for customers anymore. She was bracing herself, against the room, against the gaze that had once seen her fall and chose to look away, against the weight of being noticed and discarded, against the ache that lived not in her body, but in the hollow place where dignity had been quietly stripped away. The time you bought me, and the stitches, and the threat you gave the medic if he left me behind. The silence inside the diner thickened, not with fear, but with something heavier, respect, the kind that presses on the chest and slows the breath. Maggie sat still, her hands still raised in salute, now slowly lowering as her gaze flicked to each of their faces. The captain, the corporal, the master sergeant. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but the words caught somewhere deep in her throat. The master sergeant stepped aside, making room beside the table, and the younger Marine gently rolled the wheelchair forward. He didn't need to be told. It was understood. Something old, something ingrained, something drilled in and never forgotten. Maggie didn't resist. Her hands, worn and scarred, rested lightly on the arms of the chair. Her body moved with reluctance, not from pain, but from the weight of being seen after so long invisible. Slug stood now, but not to interfere. He stood like a man who realized he had been smaller than he thought. Red didn't move at all. Bones exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath since the door opened. The captain gave a single nod toward the table where Red and the others sat. It wasn't a threat. It didn't need to be. It was simply an acknowledgement, a boundary drawn in silence and discipline. Then she turned back toward Maggie, her voice soft now, lower but still clear. "We've got transport waiting. VA's expecting her. They'll know she's coming this time." Maggie's fingers tensed, her jaw clenched again, but differently now, like someone bracing against the unfamiliar sensation of hope. The captain waited, didn't rush her. She understood the time it took to stand when you spent years being told to sit down and shut up. Finally, Maggie nodded once, quiet but firm, like a drumbeat from the past answering roll call. The master sergeant offered his arm, not out of pity, but out of habit. She ignored it, rose on her own, slow but straight-backed. She turned to the bikers then, and for a moment no one knew what she would do. But Maggie only offered the smallest, faintest smile. Not of forgiveness, no, of something more complex. Something like, "You don't scare me, you never did, but now you know why." Then she placed one hand on the back of the wheelchair and guided it, not sat in it, through the rows of booths, out past the counter, out the door. The Marines followed her in step, boots falling in rhythm with hers. As the door swung shut behind them, the sound of tires on gravel rose again. Methodical, assured, deliberate. The laughter didn't return inside, not yet. But the silence left behind wasn't awkward. It was contemplative. And on the tabletop where Maggie had been sitting, one napkin remained half-folded beneath her empty coffee cup. Written in blue ink, scrawled in sharp, blocky letters, were three words: "Still got fight." The moment shifted, not with words, not even with a sound, but with presence. Around the diner, a subtle transformation unfolded. It started with Tom. He stood up from his booth with a calm steadiness, placing a guiding hand on Eli's shoulder as the boy rose with him. Across the room, an elderly man pushed back his chair. His Korean War veteran's cap cast a shadow over his eyes as he slowly stood too. Then two men in plain clothes rose, their military bearing unmistakable. National Guard, maybe. One by one, others followed. Within seconds, half the diner was on its feet. No one clapped, no one cheered. They just stood, heads high, backs straight, forming a quiet, unified front. A silent show of honor. The bikers didn't move, didn't speak. For the first time since they swaggered into the place with bravado and noise, the diner no longer belonged to them. It belonged to Maggie. And she hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't lifted a hand. She had simply been. And that had been enough. That had been everything. A week had passed since that day, the day the Marines entered Granger's diner and changed everything without a single command, without even a raised tone. But what lingered in the air wasn't just memory. It wasn't something that faded with time or could be marked by a calendar. The shift was deeper, more permanent. Something fundamental had realigned. The old clock above the kitchen still ticked along 8 minutes behind. The corner booth still let out the same familiar creak when someone slid into it. But the silence, that had changed. It no longer carried the weight of unease or held its breath in tension. Now it was filled with reverence, a quiet kind of dignity. Even the sign out front had changed. 2 days after that afternoon, the rusted old metal that read Granger's Diner was taken down without a word. No announcement, no ceremony. In its place, a hand-carved wooden sign had been mounted above the door. The letters, painted deep navy blue and lined in gold, read, "Valor Cafe, where honor is always on the menu." No fanfare marked the change. No press release, no ribbon cutting. Just a pair of hands at dawn, smoothing the wood, repainting the steps, sanding the window frames while fog still clung to the road. It was done in silence, and yet everyone noticed. Inside, the space had shifted too. A wall that had once been faded and bare now displayed a growing collage titled "Those Who Served." Framed photos lined the surface, snapshots of the town's veterans, from decades ago to just last year. Young men in digital camo, black and white portraits from the jungles of Vietnam, frozen moments from Korea. There were women too, some smiling in dress blues, others in army green, their eyes steady with purpose. They came in with their families, or sometimes alone, quietly dropping off pictures with names written on the backs in faded ink or fresh pen. At the center of the wall hung a new photo. Maggie Sloan, arms crossed, stood in front of the diner beside the 3 Marines who had walked in that day. She wasn't smiling, but her gaze told a deeper story, one that couldn't be captured in words. Something fierce, something resolute. And now, taped to the back of her wheelchair, was a frayed little patch of an American flag. Its edges had worn down over time, but it was clearly placed, proudly shown. Maggie still took her usual corner booth every afternoon. She still folded the napkins with a precision no one else could match. But she wasn't invisible anymore. People spoke to her now. Some simply nodded. Others stopped to say her name or offer a few words of thanks. But every single one looked her in the eyes when they did. The silence that used to surround her wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore. It had become something closer to recognition, and perhaps, At long last, a kind of peace. Tom and Eli visited every Friday without fail. The boy now carried a small notebook with him. He said he was collecting military stories. He'd ask questions, more each week. At first, Maggie kept her answers brief, almost guarded. But over time, she began to tell him things no one else in town had ever heard. Not tales of combat or victory, but stories of bonds forged in fire, of loyalty and sacrifice, of what it truly meant to carry someone through the worst and keep walking. Melissa, the waitress who had once stood frozen behind the counter, had changed too. She'd been the one too paralyzed to move when Maggie hit the floor that day. But since then, something had stirred in her. She took it upon herself to learn every rank in the Marine Corps. She'd quiz Maggie on her breaks, scribble notes on receipts, studying the difference between chevrons and bars. She began wearing tiny flag pins on her apron. Just small symbols, but they meant something now. Dave, the manager, said nothing about what had happened, but his actions spoke louder. He shaved the beard he'd worn for years. He started wearing a tie again. Then he quietly hired 2 new part-time workers that same week, both veterans. One manned the grill, the other stayed late to clean after hours. Neither of them said much, but they showed up early. They worked hard. And above all, they carried themselves with that same quiet pride. Maggie trained them both, not with speeches, not with ceremony, just a nod, a gesture, a quiet correction when something wasn't aligned. The world outside hadn't paused. Life went on. But within those diner walls, something sacred had taken root. Something born not from grand gestures, but from silent stands. A single moment had turned into a legacy, and Valor Cafe now stood as proof that respect, once earned, doesn't fade. It only grows. The folding might not have been sharp enough, but without fail, every Thursday at exactly 1800 hours, the same military SUV rolled into the parking lot of Valor Cafe. Out stepped Sergeant Collins, Captain Reyes, and Corporal Jenkins. They didn't make an entrance, didn't command attention. They simply walked in, calm and quiet, and joined Maggie at her usual table. No standing on ceremony, no loud greetings. They sipped their coffee and sometimes told stories. Stories so powerful the whole room seemed to pause. Not out of fear, but something deeper, more solemn. Reverence. They never introduced themselves. They didn't have to. Even folks unfamiliar with military life could feel it. That silent bond of people who had seen too much and lost even more, whose shared weight was carried not with complaint, but with dignity. No one clapped. There was no spotlight. Yet everyone knew, and maybe the clearest sign of all, the table where Redbones and Slug had once sat, that table remained untouched. Nobody ever said it was off limits, no plaque, no rule, but it stayed empty, as if the space itself remembered, like it had soaked up what had happened and refused to forget. People tend to steer clear of painful memories, even when the surface is wiped clean. The bell above the door jingled softly, the kind of sound you'd expect on a lazy Sunday morning in a sleepy town. But this evening, that jingle carried more weight. The sun had begun to slip behind the hills of Hickory Falls, casting golden light and long shadows across the windows of the cafe. Margaret Maggie Sloan sat in her usual corner booth, idly polishing a salt shaker that didn't really need polishing. Outside the window, the view was as familiar as breath, a gravel lot peppered with dusty pickup trucks, and across the road, a weather-worn American flag fading on the wall of the fire station. But something new had entered the picture. A young man stood uncertainly in the doorway. Couldn't have been more than 18. His dress uniform was crisp, almost stiff, but hung just a little loose on his lean frame. He gripped his cap with both hands like he was afraid it might escape if he let go. His boots gleamed, too clean, the kind of shine only seen on boots that hadn't tasted dirt yet. Maggie recognized the posture instantly, the nerves, the effort to mask them. Shoulders pulled back, chin lifted in forced confidence, knees stiff as boards. He didn't know where to go, didn't know what came next. His eyes scanned the room, landed on her, and for just a second she thought he might bolt. She stopped him with a look, not a smile, not a wave, just the faintest nod, the kind you give when you have been there, when you understand. He stepped forward. "First deployment?" she asked evenly. He gave a quick nod. "Yes, ma'am, shipping out tomorrow morning." She motioned toward the seat across from her own. Have a seat. Coffee's decent. Company's better. He hesitated. I don't want to intrude. You're not, she said, gesturing again. You're part of something now, just continuing the line. He slid into the booth, still holding his cap tight. Maggie poured a cup of coffee for him without asking if he wanted one. At the counter, Corporal Jenkins silently lifted his mug in acknowledgement. Across the diner, Captain Reyes and Master Sergeant Collins did the same, raising their cups, not as a ritual, but with quiet, deliberate meaning. The young man noticed. Slowly, he began to realize the entire room had turned its attention toward him, not staring, not judging, but seeing him, welcoming him, marking the moment. You belong here. You're not invisible. You're not alone. He blinked, eyes damp from the weight of it all, and Maggie reached a hand across the table, resting it gently near his. Whatever comes next, she said softly, remember this place. Remember who you are before the noise starts. That's the part of you that'll get you home. He nodded again. Yes, ma'am. In the weeks that followed, Valor Cafe changed, or maybe it just became more of what it already was. It wasn't just a place to grab a bite anymore. It became a kind of waypoint, a quiet sanctuary where stories were handed down, not in full but in fragments, enough to matter. Maggie was invited to speak at the local high school, but she didn't talk about medals or firefights or glory. Instead, she spoke about duty, what it means to carry someone when they can't take another step. She spoke about silence, not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that builds strength. And across Hickory Falls, people began to listen. Veterans began placing small signs in their windows, quiet declarations that read simply, "Veterans served here." Always. In the town square, a modest black granite memorial was set into the earth, not towering, not grand, but deeply intentional. One line carved in silver stood solemnly across its face, to those who served with dignity and to those who stood with them. And something shifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Veterans who once moved through town with lowered eyes and quiet steps began to wear their hats again. The old, worn ones with embroidered units and ranks. Pins that had long sat untouched in drawers found their way onto lapels. Medals that once only gathered dust were now worn proudly, not to boast, but to remember. There was one man, older now, who hadn't stepped inside the local diner in what felt like decades. He began showing up again every Sunday morning, a bronze star gleaming against his soft flannel shirt. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. Just sitting there was enough. And Maggie never moved from her usual place. The corner booth by the window, where the light poured in just right. That had always been hers. But now she was no longer sitting alone. Each Sunday, a young woman started joining her. She looked barely past 20, her posture still stiff with military training. She asked questions, some hesitant, others bursting with urgency, about basic training, about commanding others, about what fear feels like when it lives in your chest for too long. Maggie never sugarcoated anything. She answered with a voice that had already been through the fire, honest, steady, weathered by war and softened by time. She didn't tell stories to impress. She told them so others wouldn't feel so alone. And always, parked just outside in the gravel lot, that green SUV waited. It never missed a Sunday. Rain, snow, blazing sun, there it sat, in the same space, the engine humming quietly as if keeping time. Taped to the inside of the driver's side window was a faded piece of paper, corners curling from age. The message, handwritten and never once updated, read, "We always come back for those who never quit." Inside that small-town Idaho diner, where the air smelled of fresh coffee and the walls held 1,000 unspoken stories, Maggie Sloan finally belonged. She wasn't just the veteran in the booth. She wasn't just the survivor who kept showing up. She had become the quiet pulse of a town that had finally remembered what it meant to stand up straight. There are stories that echo in us not because of what was spoken, but because of what was held in silence. Maggie never once asked for praise. She didn't seek recognition. And yet, in the stillness of her presence, she reminded every soul who passed through that place that dignity doesn't come wrapped in fanfare. It doesn't need a stage or a speech. It just needs to be witnessed. These days, we move fast. We scroll past pain. We assume the strongest among us have it all handled. But maybe this story, quiet and stubborn as it is a call to slow down, to really look, to recognize the everyday warriors sitting right beside us. The veteran 2 doors down, the older woman who bags her own groceries in silence, the man with the limp who holds the door open without ever expecting a thank you. Respect isn't something granted because of a uniform. It's something owed to those who carried burdens the rest of us will never fully comprehend. So maybe ask yourself this. Have you ever seen someone hold steady when it would have been easier to fall apart? Have you witnessed someone stand tall when the world turned its back? Or maybe, just maybe, you were that person and no one ever noticed. Then say something, share it, speak their name, tell the story. Because tales like Maggie's don't just belong in the past. They reflect back at us, challenging us to do better, right now with the people standing quietly beside us. To every veteran, every caregiver, every quiet soul who's ever kept going without applause, you are not invisible here. We see you, we thank you, and we will not look away.